How to never get angry or bothered by anyone. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and realizing that nobody can upset you anymore. Not your boss, who micromanages every detail of your work. Not the driver who cuts you off without signaling. Not your family member who knows exactly which buttons to push. Not the colleague who takes credit for your ideas. None of them have any power over your emotional state whatsoever. Most people think this is impossible. They believe that getting angry when someone disrespects them is natural, inevitable, even justified. They've accepted that certain people will always have the ability to ruin their day, spike their blood pressure, and steal their peace of mind. But what if I told you that this entire belief system is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how emotions actually work? Let me share a story that changed everything for me. A few years ago, I watched a senior executive named Michael handle a situation that would have sent most people into a rage. During a board meeting, a junior analyst publicly accused him of making a decision that cost the company millions. The accusation was unfair, inaccurate, and delivered with shocking disrespect in front of the entire leadership team. Everyone in that room held their breath, waiting for the explosion. Michael had every right to be furious. His reputation was being attacked. His judgment was being questioned. His authority was being undermined. But here's what happened instead. Michael nodded slowly, maintained steady eye contact, and said calmly, "That's an interesting perspective. Let's look at the actual data together so everyone can see the full picture." Within 5 minutes, he had calmly dismantled every point of the accusation without raising his voice, without defensiveness, without a trace of anger. The analyst apologized, the board was impressed, and Michael's reputation was enhanced rather than damaged. After the meeting, I asked him how he stayed so calm. His answer was simple: "I stopped giving people permission to control how I feel." That conversation led me on a journey to understand the mechanics of anger and emotional reactivity. I studied neuroscience, interviewed people who seemed impossibly calm under pressure, and tested dozens of techniques on myself. What I discovered is that the ability to never get angry or bothered by anyone isn't a personality trait or a gift. It's a learnable skill built on specific principles that anyone can master. The first thing you need to understand is what anger actually is and why it feels so automatic. When someone does something that violates your expectations or seems to threaten you in some way, a tiny almond-shaped structure in your brain called the amygdala detects this as danger. In less than a quarter of a second, before you're even consciously aware of what's happening, this threat detection system triggers a cascade of chemical reactions in your body. Stress hormones flood your bloodstream, your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, your breathing becomes shallow. Blood flows away from your prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking part of your brain, and redirects to your limbs in preparation for fighting or fleeing. This is the famous fight or flight response, and it's the same biological reaction your ancestors had when facing predators. Here's the problem: your brain cannot distinguish between a physical threat and a social one. It treats someone insulting you at work the same way it treats a hungry lion. The person who cuts you off in traffic triggers the same survival response as an actual attack on your life. You're experiencing Stone-Age neurochemistry in response to modern problems, and this mismatch is the root cause of almost all interpersonal anger. But here's what changes everything. This response is not inevitable. The anger you feel is not being caused by other people. It's being caused by your brain's interpretation of what other people do, and interpretations can be changed. When you truly grasp this distinction, you've taken the first step toward emotional freedom. Most people operate under what I call the external control illusion. They believe that their emotions are direct responses to external events. Someone insults them, so they feel angry. Someone betrays them, so they feel hurt. Someone inconveniences them, so they feel frustrated. In this model, other people are pulling the strings of your emotional state like a puppet master. But neuroscience tells a different story. Between the external event and your emotional response, there's an invisible step that most people never notice: interpretation. You don't get angry because someone insulted you. You get angry because you interpreted their words as an attack, assigned meaning to their behavior, and told yourself a story about what it means. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine you're walking down the street and someone you know walks right past you without saying hello. If you interpret this as intentional rudeness, you'll feel angry or hurt. If you interpret it as them being preoccupied with their own problems, you'll feel neutral or even concerned for them. If you interpret it as them not seeing you because they're nearsighted, you'll feel nothing at all. Same event, three different emotional outcomes, entirely based on interpretation. This is monumentally important because it means you have far more control over your emotional responses than you've been led to believe. You cannot control what other people do, but you can absolutely control how you interpret what they do. And when you change your interpretations, you change your emotional experience. The reason most people never develop this control is that they've never been taught to recognize the interpretation step. The process happens so quickly and automatically that it feels like the emotion is a direct response to the event. Someone yells at you, and instantly you feel angry. The interpretation happens in the gap between the yelling and the anger, but it happens so fast that you don't notice it. Learning to slow down this process and become conscious of your interpretations is the foundation of never getting angry or bothered by anyone. It's not about suppressing your emotions or pretending everything is fine. It's about recognizing that you're constantly making choices about what things mean, and those choices determine how you feel. There are three specific interpretation patterns that cause the majority of interpersonal anger, and once you understand them, you can start to dismantle them. The first pattern is what I call personalization. This is when you interpret other people's behavior as being about you when it almost never is. Someone doesn't return your phone call, and you immediately think they're ignoring you or don't value your relationship. A colleague is short with you in an email, and you assume they're angry at you. Your spouse forgets to do something you asked, and you interpret it as them not caring about your needs. In all of these cases, you're making other people's behavior about you, when the reality is that their behavior is almost always about them. That person who didn't return your call might be overwhelmed with work, dealing with a family emergency, or simply forgot. The colleague who sent a short email might be stressed about a deadline, working from their phone, or just naturally concise in written communication. Your spouse who forgot your request might be preoccupied with their own concerns, have a bad memory, or genuinely didn't register the importance of the task. When you personalize other people's behavior, you give them enormous power over your emotional state. Every interaction becomes a referendum on your worth, your importance, or how much people care about you. This is exhausting and creates constant opportunities for anger and hurt feelings. The antidote to personalization is what I call the depersonalization practice. Whenever you notice yourself having an emotional reaction to someone's behavior, stop and ask yourself, what are 3 ways this could have nothing to do with me? Force yourself to generate alternative explanations that don't center on you. This simple practice weakens the automatic personalization response and helps you see situations more accurately. The second interpretation pattern that generates anger is what I call rigid expectations. This is when you have fixed ideas about how people should behave, and you get angry when they don't conform to your expectations. You expect people to be on time, so you're furious when they're late. You expect people to be respectful, so you're outraged when they're rude. You expect people to communicate clearly, so you're frustrated when they're vague. The problem with rigid expectations is that they set you up for constant disappointment. People are not going to behave according to your preferences. They're going to behave according to their own values, habits, stress levels, and circumstances. When you demand that reality conform to your expectations, you're essentially arguing with what is, and you will lose that argument every time. This doesn't mean you shouldn't have standards or boundaries. It means you shouldn't let your emotional state depend on whether others meet your standards. You can prefer that people be punctual without getting angry when they're late. You can value respect without being emotionally devastated when someone is disrespectful. You can appreciate clear communication without being frustrated by ambiguity. The practice here is what I call expectation flexibility. Instead of thinking people should behave this way, shift to I prefer when people behave this way, but I accept that they often won't. This subtle language shift has profound psychological effects. It maintains your preferences while releasing your attachment to controlling others. The third interpretation pattern that causes anger is what I call the control fantasy. This is the belief that your anger will somehow change other people's behavior or punish them in a meaningful way. You get angry at your teenager, thinking your anger will teach them to be more responsible. You get angry at a difficult coworker, believing your anger will make them realize they're being unreasonable. You get angry at terrible drivers, as if your horn honking, and frustration will make them better people. The control fantasy is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. People almost never change because you're angry with them. In fact, anger usually makes people more defensive, more resistant, and more likely to double down on whatever behavior upsets you. Your anger doesn't educate them. It doesn't motivate them. It doesn't make them see the error of their ways. It just creates more conflict and uses up your emotional energy. What actually changes people's behavior is clear communication, consistent consequences, and sometimes just removing yourself from situations where people behave in ways you find unacceptable. None of these require anger. In fact, they're all more effective when you're calm. The practice here is what I call consequence consciousness. Before you get angry, ask yourself, what do I actually want to happen here, and will anger help achieve that goal? Almost always, the answer is no. This doesn't mean you don't take action. It means you take action from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. Understanding these three interpretation patterns gives you the cognitive framework for emotional control, but knowledge alone isn't enough. You also need to understand the physical and neurological dimensions of anger, because anger isn't just a thought process. It's a full body experience that can hijack your system before your rational mind has a chance to intervene. This is where the concept of emotional hijacking becomes critical. When your amygdala detects a threat, it initiates what's called the stress response. This happens automatically and very quickly. Within a fraction of a second, your entire physiology changes. Adrenaline and cortisol flood your system. Your heart pounds, your face flushes, your hands might shake or clench into fists. During this stress response, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thinking, impulse control, and decision making, partially shuts down. This is why people say and do things when they're angry that they later regret. They're literally not thinking clearly. Their higher cognitive functions are temporarily impaired by the neurochemical storm of the stress response. The key to never getting angry or bothered by anyone is learning to intervene in this process before the stress response reaches its peak. You cannot prevent the initial activation of your amygdala. That's automatic and happens below the level of conscious control. But you can prevent that initial activation from cascading into a full emotional hijacking that compromises your judgment and behavior. The intervention window is very small, approximately 6 to 10 seconds. This is the time between the initial physiological activation and the point where the stress hormones have fully flooded your system and shut down your executive functioning. If you can implement specific techniques during this window, you can prevent the anger from taking control. The first technique is what I call sensation awareness. The moment you notice any physical sign of activation, any hint that your body is beginning the stress response, you mentally label it. You might notice your jaw clenching, your shoulders tensing, your breathing becoming shallow, or heat rising in your chest. The instant you detect any of these signals, you think or say to yourself, I'm noticing activation, or I'm experiencing the beginning of a stress response. This might seem too simple to be effective, but there's powerful neuroscience behind it. The act of labeling your emotional experience activates your prefrontal cortex, the same part of your brain that the stress response is trying to shut down. When you label what you're feeling, you're engaging the rational, observing part of your brain, which dampens the reactive, emotional part. Research by UCLA neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman has shown that this technique, which he calls affect labeling, can reduce the intensity of negative emotional reactions by up to 50%. Just by naming what you're experiencing, you're already regaining control. The second technique is deliberate breathing. The instant you've labeled your activation, you shift your attention to your breath and take 3 slow, deep breaths. Here's the specific pattern that's most effective. Inhale slowly through your nose for a count of 4. Pause and hold for a count of 2. Exhale slowly through your mouth for a count of 6. The longer exhale is crucial because it activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the rest and digest response. This is the opposite of the fight or flight response. When you activate your parasympathetic nervous system, you're sending a signal to your body that there's no real danger, that it's safe to calm down. This directly counteracts the stress response. While you're breathing, focus all of your attention on the physical sensation of the breath. Feel the air moving through your nostrils. Notice your chest and belly expanding. Feel the air leaving your body. This mindful attention serves 2 purposes. First, it keeps you anchored in the present moment rather than spinning stories about what just happened or what you should do next. Second, it continues to engage your prefrontal cortex, maintaining the connection to your rational brain. The third technique is what I call the pause protocol. After you've labeled your activation and taken 3 deep breaths, you create space before responding. This might be as simple as counting to 10 in your head before speaking. It might be excusing yourself from a conversation to take a brief walk. In written communication, like email or text, it might be closing the message and coming back to it an hour later. The pause serves a critical function. It allows the initial chemical surge of the stress response to metabolize. Those stress hormones don't stay in your system indefinitely. They peak quickly and then begin to dissipate. If you can avoid taking action during the peak, you'll find that after even a few minutes, you have much better access to your rational thinking and can respond more skillfully. Many people resist the pause because they think it makes them look weak, or because they're afraid of losing the argument or letting someone get away with bad behavior. But the pause is actually a sign of strength. It demonstrates that you're in control of yourself rather than being controlled by your emotions. And it dramatically increases the likelihood that your response will be effective rather than just emotionally satisfying in the moment. These 3 techniques, sensation awareness, deliberate breathing, and the pause protocol, form what I call the intervention sequence. When you practice this sequence consistently, you train your brain to respond differently to triggers. You're creating new neural pathways that prioritize conscious choice over automatic reactivity. But let's be realistic about what this looks like in practice. You're not going to get it right every time, especially at first. You'll have moments where you completely forget to use these techniques and react angrily, just like you always have. This is normal and expected. You're working against years or decades of ingrained patterns, and rewiring your brain takes time and repetition. The key is what you do after you've had a reactive moment. Most people either beat themselves up for losing control, which just adds more negative emotion to the situation, or they justify their anger by focusing on how the other person deserved it, which reinforces the reactive pattern. Neither of these responses helps you improve. Instead, treat every reactive moment as data. After you've calmed down, spend a few minutes analyzing what happened. What specifically triggered you? What physical sensations did you notice before you reacted? What story did you tell yourself about what was happening? What could you have done differently? This analysis isn't about self-criticism. It's about understanding your personal trigger patterns so you can recognize them earlier next time. Over time, you'll notice that you're catching yourself earlier in the activation process. The first few times, you might not notice until you're already yelling. Then you'll start noticing when you're very angry but haven't acted on it yet. Then you'll notice when you're moderately activated. Eventually, you'll notice the very first hint of tension or irritation, and that's when the intervention is easiest and most effective. This progression happens through a process called neuroplasticity, which is your brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections. Every time you successfully intervene in an emotional hijacking, every time you choose a calm response over an angry one, you're strengthening the neural pathways associated with emotional regulation. You're literally rewiring your brain to make composure easier and anger harder. The people who seem naturally calm and unflappable haven't eliminated their amygdala or their stress response. They've simply trained their brains through thousands of repetitions to activate the intervention sequence quickly and automatically. What once required conscious effort now happens almost reflexively, but neural rewiring is only part of the solution. You also need to address the mental frameworks and belief systems that make you vulnerable to anger in the first place. This is where the concept of cognitive reframing becomes essential. Reframing is the process of consciously choosing to interpret events in ways that don't trigger anger. Remember, anger is not caused by events themselves, but by your interpretation of events. If you can train yourself to interpret situations differently, you can eliminate much of your anger before it even begins. Let me give you some powerful reframes that you can practice. The first is what I call the ignorance reframe. When someone behaves in a way that seems rude, inconsiderate, or hurtful, your automatic interpretation might be that they're a bad person, that they're intentionally trying to hurt you, or that they don't care about you. The ignorance reframe offers a different interpretation. They simply don't know better. Maybe they were never taught better social skills or emotional intelligence. Maybe they're operating with a completely different set of cultural norms or expectations. Maybe they genuinely don't realize their behavior is problematic. This reframe doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it shifts you from anger to something more like compassion, or at least neutral observation. The second powerful reframe is what I call the pain reframe. This is based on the psychological principle that hurt people hurt people. When someone is aggressive, critical, or mean, they're usually operating from their own pain, insecurity, or emotional wounds. Someone who is genuinely happy and at peace doesn't lash out at others. Hurtful behavior is almost always a symptom of internal suffering. When you adopt the pain reframe, you start to see difficult behavior as a cry for help rather than an attack. The colleague who constantly criticizes everyone is probably deeply insecure about their own performance. The family member who makes cutting remarks is likely dealing with their own feelings of inadequacy. The stranger who's rude to you in public might be having the worst day of their life. Again, this doesn't excuse the behavior, and it doesn't mean you have to tolerate it. But it dramatically changes your emotional response. It's very hard to stay angry at someone when you recognize that their behavior is coming from a place of pain. The third reframe is what I call the mirror reframe. This one is harder to swallow, but it's incredibly powerful. When something about another person really bothers you, when you have a disproportionately strong reaction to their behavior, there's a good chance you're seeing something in them that you haven't fully accepted in yourself. The person whose arrogance enraged you might be reflecting back aspects of your own ego that you've judged and suppressed. The person whose neediness irritates you might be showing you your own dependency needs that you're uncomfortable acknowledging. The person who seems fake might be highlighting the ways you feel inauthentic. This doesn't apply to every annoyance, but when you notice yourself having an unusually strong reaction to someone, it's worth asking, what is this person showing me about myself? Often, your anger at others is really unresolved anger at yourself, projected outward. The fourth reframe is what I call the teacher reframe. This is the practice of seeing every difficult person as a teacher who's helping you develop emotional mastery. That impossibly demanding boss, they're your patience teacher. That passive-aggressive coworker, they're your boundary-setting teacher. That critical family member, they're your self-acceptance teacher. When you adopt this frame, difficult people stop being problems and become opportunities for growth. You might even feel grateful for them because they're giving you chances to practice your skills in real-world conditions. This reframe is particularly powerful because it completely flips the script on victimhood. You're no longer suffering at the hands of difficult people. You're actively using them to become stronger. Practicing these reframes requires conscious effort at first. When something triggers you, you have to deliberately stop and ask yourself, how else could I interpret this situation? You have to generate alternative explanations and perspectives, even when your initial interpretation feels obviously true. Over time, with consistent practice, these alternative interpretations start to arise more automatically. You'll notice that your first reaction to difficult behavior starts to shift. Where you once immediately felt angry, you might now automatically consider that the person is having a hard day, acting from ignorance, or reflecting something you need to examine in yourself. This shift in automatic interpretation is the holy grail of emotional mastery, because it prevents anger from arising in the first place, rather than requiring you to manage it after it's already been triggered. Now let's talk about a dimension of anger prevention that most people completely overlook: energy management. Your baseline stress level, your physical health, and your overall energy reserves have an enormous impact on your susceptibility to anger. Think about it. When you're well, rested, physically healthy, and emotionally resourced, minor annoyances barely register. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you barely notice. A colleague makes a thoughtless comment and you let it roll off. But when you're exhausted, hungry, stressed, or depleted, those same exact events can send you into a rage. Same external trigger, completely different response, entirely based on your internal state. This is because emotional regulation requires energy. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for impulse control and rational thinking, is energy intensive. When your overall energy is low, your prefrontal cortex functions poorly, and your amygdala becomes hyperactive. You perceive more threats, react more strongly to them, and have less capacity to regulate your responses. This means that building anger resistance isn't just about managing your reactions in the moment. It's about maintaining the physical and emotional resources that make emotional regulation possible. There are several key practices that dramatically improve your baseline resilience. The first is sleep optimization. Sleep deprivation has a devastating effect on emotional regulation. When you don't get enough quality sleep, your amygdala activity increases by up to 60%, while your prefrontal cortex activity decreases. This combination makes you significantly more reactive and less able to control your reactions. Even one night of poor sleep can impair your emotional regulation for the entire next day. Chronic sleep deprivation creates a state of constant vulnerability to anger. If you're serious about never getting angry or bothered by anyone, you have to be serious about getting 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep every night. The second practice is blood sugar stability. When your blood sugar drops, your body releases stress hormones to bring it back up. These are the same stress hormones that are released during the fight or flight response. Low blood sugar literally puts your body in a state of stress, making you more irritable and reactive. Eating regular meals with adequate protein, healthy fats, and complex carbohydrates keeps your blood sugar stable and your stress hormones in check. Skipping meals or relying on sugar and caffeine for energy creates blood sugar spikes and crashes that make emotional regulation much more difficult. The third practice is regular physical activity. Exercise is one of the most powerful tools for managing stress and improving emotional regulation. It metabolizes stress hormones, increases endorphins, improves sleep quality, and enhances overall brain function. People who exercise regularly have measurably better emotional control than those who don't. You don't need to become an athlete. Even 30 minutes of moderate activity most days of the week makes a significant difference. The key is consistency. Regular movement keeps your baseline stress level low and your emotional resilience high. The fourth practice is what I call emotional hygiene. Just as you brush your teeth every day to prevent cavities, you need daily practices that prevent emotional buildup. This might include meditation, journaling, talking with a trusted friend, spending time in nature, or engaging in creative activities. These practices give you a way to process and release emotional tension before it accumulates to the point where small triggers cause big reactions. Most people only think about managing their emotions when they're already upset. Emotional hygiene is about maintaining your emotional well-being proactively. The fifth practice is ruthless input management. In today's world, you're constantly bombarded with information designed to trigger strong emotional reactions. News media thrives on outrage and fear. Social media algorithms prioritize content that generates engagement, which usually means content that makes you angry, anxious, or upset. If you start your day by checking the news or scrolling social media, you're filling your mind with triggering content before you've even had a chance to establish a calm baseline. You're essentially mainlining stress and outrage, and then you're surprised when you're reactive and irritable all day. Managing your information diet isn't about being uninformed. It's about being strategic about what you consume, when you consume it, and how much you consume. You can stay informed without marinating in outrage. You can be aware of current events without letting them hijack your emotional state. These 5 practices, sleep, nutrition, exercise, emotional hygiene, and input management, create the foundation for emotional resilience. When your foundation is strong, you can handle far more challenging situations without getting angry or bothered. When your foundation is weak, even minor irritations can push you over the edge. Now, let's address a question that often comes up at this point. What about righteous anger? What about situations where anger seems justified, even necessary? What about injustice, abuse, or serious wrongdoing? Isn't anger sometimes the appropriate response? This is an important question, and the answer is nuanced. There's a difference between recognizing that something is wrong and needs to be addressed versus having an uncontrolled emotional reaction to it. You can be deeply opposed to injustice. You can take strong action against wrongdoing. You can set firm boundaries against abuse, all without anger. In fact, anger often makes you less effective at addressing serious problems, not more effective. When you're angry, your thinking becomes less strategic, your communication becomes less persuasive, and your actions become less precise. Anger feels powerful, but it rarely leads to the most effective responses. The most impactful people I've studied, people who have created real change in the world, have learned to channel their passion and conviction without being controlled by anger. They feel the emotional response, they recognize it, but they don't act from it. They act from clarity, strategy, and commitment. This is what I call clean anger versus dirty anger. Dirty anger is reactive, impulsive, and focused on venting or punishing. It feels good in the moment, but rarely produces positive outcomes. Clean anger is conscious, strategic, and focused on solving problems or creating change. It uses the energy of anger without the loss of control. The practice here is learning to feel the signal that anger provides without obeying the impulse to react. Anger is information. It tells you that something is violating your values or boundaries. That information is valuable. But the reactive behaviors that usually accompany anger, yelling, attacking, saying hurtful things, are rarely valuable. You can notice the anger, thank it for the information it's providing, and then consciously choose your response based on what's most likely to be effective. This isn't suppression, it's sophistication. It's the difference between being controlled by your emotions and using your emotions as data while maintaining agency over your behavior. Let's talk about specific types of people and situations that commonly trigger anger and how to remain unbothered by each. One of the most challenging scenarios is dealing with people who are overtly aggressive or hostile. These are the people who yell, who use intimidation, who seem to be trying to provoke a fight. The natural response to aggression is either to match it with equal aggression or to retreat in fear. Both of these responses are giving the aggressive person exactly what they want, either a fight they can escalate or submission they can exploit. The sovereignty response is to refuse to play the game. When someone becomes aggressive, your job is to stay calm and grounded. Anchor yourself physically. Feel your feet on the floor. Lengthen your spine. Breathe slowly and deeply. Don't match their energy level. Instead, lower your voice and speak more slowly than normal. This has a neurological effect where your calm can actually help de-escalate their arousal. Maintain steady but not aggressive eye contact. Keep your body language open but grounded. Don't make yourself small, but don't puff up defensively either. Use a technique called the broken record, where you pick one simple, reasonable statement and repeat it calmly no matter how much they escalate. I want to find a solution that works for both of us, or I'm happy to discuss this when we can both be calm. The key insight is that aggression is almost always driven by fear or insecurity. People who feel truly powerful don't need to intimidate others. When you refuse to be intimidated and remain unshakably calm, you're often the first person who hasn't reinforced their aggressive pattern, and sometimes that alone begins to shift the dynamic. Another challenging type is the passive-aggressive person. These people express anger and frustration indirectly through sarcasm, forgetting, chronic lateness, or subtle sabotage. When confronted, they deny there's a problem and make you feel like you're imagining things or being too sensitive. The key to dealing with passive-aggressive people is direct, calm communication about patterns rather than specific incidents. I've noticed that the last 4 times we set a deadline, the work wasn't completed on time. This pattern is creating problems. Moving forward, I need to know immediately if you can't meet a deadline so I can make alternative arrangements. This approach names the pattern clearly without arguing about intentions or getting drawn into their denials. It focuses on observable behavior and sets clear expectations and consequences. You're taking the passive, aggressive dynamic out of the shadows and into the light, which removes much of its power. A third challenging type is what I call the emotional vampire. These people constantly complain, dramatize every situation, and drain the energy of everyone around them. They always have a crisis. They never take advice. They seem to feed on sympathy and attention. The key here is compassionate boundaries. You can care about someone without taking responsibility for their emotional state. Set time limits for conversations. I have 15 minutes right now. What's most important? Resist the urge to solve their problems or rescue them from consequences of their own choices. When they describe problems, ask, "What do you think you'll do?" rather than jumping in with solutions. The important thing to understand about emotional vampires is that drama serves a purpose for them, usually unconscious. It generates attention, creates a sense of aliveness, or allows them to avoid taking responsibility. When you refuse to feed the drama but maintain basic kindness, you're setting a boundary that protects your energy without abandoning them. A fourth challenging type is the person who takes credit for others' work. They appropriate your ideas, present your contributions as their own, and seem to have no shame about it. This can trigger intense anger because it feels like theft and injustice. The key is strategic documentation and attribution. Before meetings where you'll present ideas, send emails outlining your thinking. During meetings, use language that anchors attribution, building on the framework I developed. Or, as I outlined in my memo, after meetings or projects, send summary emails that make clear who contributed what. If someone directly steals credit, you can reclaim it gracefully. "I'm glad the approach I developed is getting support. Let me walk through the thinking behind it." This isn't aggressive or confrontational, but it clearly reestablishes ownership. The deeper practice here is not attaching your self-worth to whether you get credit. Do excellent work because you're committed to excellence, not because you need external validation. When you're secure in your own value, credit theft becomes an annoyance to manage strategically rather than a source of anger. A fifth challenging type is the chronic critic. Nothing is ever good enough for these people. They always find fault. They seem to take pleasure in pointing out flaws and shortcomings. The key is understanding that chronic criticism is usually more about the critic than about you. People who are secure and content don't need to constantly tear things down. Criticism often serves to make the critic feel superior or to mask their own insecurities. When you receive criticism, practice what I call selective integration. Extract anything useful from the feedback while discarding the rest. Ask clarifying questions that force them to be specific. What exactly would meet your standard? Sometimes this reveals valuable feedback. Other times it exposes that they don't actually have standards, just a need to criticize. Most importantly, develop what I call critic immunity. Before sharing work or ideas with chronic critics, ask yourself, if this person hates it, does it actually matter? Often you'll realize their opinion has no real consequence. This mental reframe eliminates their power over your emotional state. Understanding these specific types and having tailored strategies for each makes you far less likely to be triggered. You're not surprised by their behavior because you understand the psychology behind it. You have a plan for how to respond, so you're not caught off guard and forced to react instinctively. But even with all these techniques and frameworks, there will be moments when you slip up. You'll get angry. You'll be bothered. You'll react in ways you later regret. This is normal and part of the learning process. The question is what you do with these moments. The worst thing you can do is beat yourself up or conclude that you're failing. Self-criticism activates the same threat response as external criticism. You're just adding more stress and negative emotion to an already difficult situation. It also reinforces a victim identity where you see yourself as someone who can't control their emotions. Instead, treat every reactive moment as valuable data. After you've calmed down, spend a few minutes doing what I call a reaction autopsy. What specific event triggered you? What physical sensations did you notice? What story did you tell yourself about what was happening? What alternative interpretations were available but you didn't access? What could you do differently next time? This analysis is not about judgment. It's about understanding your unique trigger patterns and response tendencies. Everyone's triggers are slightly different based on their history, values, and sensitivities. The better you understand your own patterns, the earlier you can recognize when you're being triggered, and the more effectively you can intervene. Keep a simple log of these reaction autopsies. Over time, you'll notice patterns. Maybe you're most reactive when you're tired. Maybe certain topics or types of people consistently trigger you. Maybe your reactions are stronger when you haven't eaten. These patterns are incredibly valuable because they tell you where you're vulnerable and what you need to work on. You'll also notice, if you're consistent with the practices I've outlined, that the time between trigger and reaction starts to lengthen. At first, you might not catch yourself until after you've already exploded. Then you'll start noticing when you're very angry but haven't acted yet. Then you'll notice moderate activation. Eventually, you'll notice the very first whisper of irritation, and that's when intervention is easiest. This progression is your nervous system being retrained. You're developing what neuroscientists call interoceptive awareness, the ability to notice subtle internal signals. The better your interoceptive awareness, the earlier you can intervene in emotional reactions. Think of it like learning to ride a bike. At first, you fall over constantly. Then you can balance for a few seconds, then for longer periods. Eventually, balancing becomes automatic, and you don't even think about it. Emotional regulation follows the same learning curve. It's clumsy and effortful at first, but with practice it becomes natural and automatic. The people who seem impossibly calm and unbothered haven't eliminated their triggers. They've developed early warning systems and automatic intervention responses. They've rewired their brains through thousands of repetitions. What looks like natural temperament is actually learned skill. There's one final piece I need to address: the identity shift. All the techniques I've shared are valuable, but they'll always feel like effort, like something you're forcing yourself to do, until you shift your fundamental identity. You have to stop seeing yourself as someone who struggles with anger and start seeing yourself as someone who is naturally calm and unbothered. This identity shift happens gradually through consistent practice, but you can accelerate it by consciously reinforcing your new identity. After you successfully stay calm in a triggering situation, take a moment to acknowledge it. That's who I am. I'm someone who stays calm under pressure. When you slip up, instead of saying I'm so bad at this, say that wasn't consistent with who I'm becoming. These might seem like small linguistic shifts, but they have profound psychological effects. You're training your mind to see calmness as your natural state, rather than something you have to fight for. You're building a self-concept that supports emotional sovereignty rather than one that reinforces reactivity. Over time, as you accumulate evidence of your new identity through consistent practice, your brain starts to believe it. Your default assumptions about yourself change. Where you once thought, I have a short fuse, you start to think, I'm remarkably unflappable. This new identity then becomes self-reinforcing. You act in ways that are consistent with your identity, which generates more evidence, which strengthens the identity further. This is the ultimate goal, not just having techniques to manage anger, but becoming the kind of person who rarely experiences anger in the first place because you interpret the world differently. You maintain the physical and emotional resources that make regulation easy, and you've trained your nervous system to default to calm. When you reach this point, you've achieved something remarkable. You're moving through the same world as everyone else, encountering the same difficult people and challenging situations, but you're experiencing it completely differently. What bothers others doesn't bother you. What angers others leaves you unmoved. You've achieved genuine emotional freedom. This freedom doesn't mean you're emotionless or disconnected. You still care deeply about people and causes. You still have preferences and opinions. You still take action when action is needed. But your emotional state is no longer determined by other people's behavior. You're sovereign over your own internal experience. Imagine what your life will look like 6 months from now if you commit to these practices. That colleague who currently ruins your day with their criticism, you'll barely notice. That family member who always pushes your buttons, you'll handle their provocations with ease. That stranger who's rude in public, you'll feel nothing but mild curiosity about what they must be going through. Your relationships will improve because you're no longer contributing to conflict escalation. Your work performance will increase because you're not wasting energy on anger and resentment. Your health will benefit because you're no longer subjecting yourself to constant stress hormones. Your overall quality of life will transform because you'll be at peace regardless of external circumstances. This isn't a fantasy. This is the predictable result of consistently applying the principles and practices I've outlined. Thousands of people have made this transformation. There's nothing special about them except their commitment to the process. The question is, are you ready to commit? Are you ready to stop being a victim of other people's behavior and take full responsibility for your emotional state? Are you ready to invest the time and effort required to rewire decades of reactive patterns? The techniques are here. The science is clear. The path is mapped. All that's missing is your decision. You can continue living in a world where other people have the power to ruin your day, spike your blood pressure, and steal your peace. Or you can step into a new reality where you're completely unbothered no matter what anyone does or says. The choice is yours, and it's available to you right now, not someday, not after you read more or learn more. Right now, in this moment, you can decide to become someone who never gets angry or bothered by anyone. What will you choose?